The night sky hung heavy over the city, the stars barely visible through a murky haze of clouds. A cold wind slipped between the buildings, rattling loose shutters and carrying with it a tense stillness that gripped the streets below. Mark Anders pulled his coat tighter around himself as he walked home, his thoughts churning. Every corner he turned felt darker than the last, every shadow deeper. He paused before the old government building he passed every day on his commute, its faded stone facade looming like a sentinel of a world that no longer existed. The announcement had come earlier that day. Mark tilted his head up, replaying the image in his mind. The hologram had filled the sky, as vast and indifferent as a god. It had spoken in the same flat, mechanical tone, the kind designed to strip words of emotion and turn proclamations into inescapable facts. The Galactic Council has determined that your civilization is unsustainable. In accordance with Galactic Directive 72, administrative oversight will be implemented immediately to ensure compliance with interstellar standards. The wind whipped at Mark's collar as he closed his eyes, hearing the subtle disdain in the voice. Compliance, oversight. It was a death knell disguised as progress. He clenched his fists in his coat pockets, the sharp corners of a folded document pressing into his palms, a directive he had snatched off his desk before leaving work. The Council's first decree had been swift and surgical, immediate taxation of Earth's resources to compensate for inefficiency. Even the air seemed heavier now, as if they'd already started taxing that too. Mark's apartment was dim and quiet when he stepped inside. He dropped his briefcase onto the floor, but instead of collapsing onto the couch like he usually did after a long day, he flicked on the desk lamp. The warm glow illuminated the chaos of papers strewn across his desk. He reached for the directive he'd brought home, his fingers brushing the edge of a coffee-stained folder. Review of Terran Tax Compliance, the header read. Beneath it, a cascade of subheadings listed new levies on water, energy, and even sunlight. Mark sat heavily in his chair, running a hand through his dark, disheveled hair. "This is madness," he muttered, the words loud in the empty room. His voice was hoarse, dry from hours of silence, but anger began to color it. He skimmed the text again, finding nothing but convoluted justifications for bleeding Earth dry. Mark stared at the alien insignia stamped at the top of the page, a perfect circle encased in jagged lines meant to symbolize unity but looking more like a trap. His lip curled as he tossed the paper aside. A knock at the door shattered the stillness. He froze, his breath catching. It was late, and no one visited unannounced anymore. When the knock came again, sharper this time, he crossed the room and peered through the peephole. Eli Vance stood in the dim hallway, his face half lit by the weak bulb overhead. He looked as ragged as Mark felt, his thin jacket doing little to protect him from the chill. Mark unlocked the door but didn't open it fully. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Eli slipped inside, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Good to see you, too," he said, his tone light but edged with urgency. He tossed a bag of takeout onto the counter, the smell of soy sauce and fried noodles filling the room. Mark shut the door and leaned against it, crossing his arms. "You shouldn't be here. You know what they're watching for." "They're watching for anyone stupid enough to talk back," Eli said, shrugging off his jacket. "Last I checked, we're just two overworked nobodies drowning in paperwork." Mark let out a bitter laugh. "Right, just nobodies." Eli's smirk faded as he took a seat at the cluttered desk. He picked up one of the scattered documents, his brow furrowing as he scanned it. "Rainwater collection?" he asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "Taxed," Mark replied flatly. Eli shook his head, tossing the paper back onto the desk. "Unbelievable. They think they can just walk in here and take whatever they want." "They don't think," Mark said, his tone sharpening. "That's the whole point. They've got systems, rules, that do the thinking for them. To them, we're not people. We're just columns in a spreadsheet." Eli leaned back in the chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied Mark. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Mark didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned toward the window, staring out at the city below. The streets were unusually empty, the glow of streetlights casting long shadows against the pavement. In the distance, the faint hum of a drone patrol vibrated in the air, a sound that had become as omnipresent as the wind. "They've got their rules," Mark said finally, his voice low. "But we've got ours too." Eli straightened. "What are you talking about?" Mark turned back to him, his expression unreadable. "Nothing," he said after a pause. "Not yet." The conversation shifted after that, but Mark's mind remained elsewhere, turning over the pieces of an idea he wasn't ready to share. He knew better than to act rashly. The council's system was vast and impenetrable, but it wasn't invincible. Monsters never were. That night, after Eli had left, Mark sat alone in the quiet, the only sound the soft rustle of papers as he sorted through the mess on his desk. His eyes lingered on the council's insignia again, his jaw tightening as he reached for his pen. If they wanted compliance, he thought, then compliance they would get, but not in the way they expected. Mark began to write, the ink flowing across the page in swift, deliberate strokes. Outside, the city slumbered under the watchful gaze of alien eyes, but within the dim confines of his apartment, a small ember of defiance began to glow. They thought they had Earth under control. They thought humanity would fall in line. Mark Anders was about to show them how wrong they were. The dawn was pale and cold, a thin gray light spilling across the city like a hesitant promise. Mark Anders sat at his desk, staring at the patch of paper-cluttered wood where his hand had fallen still hours ago. The coffee in his mug had gone lukewarm, its bitterness heavy in the air. He hadn't slept. The plan he'd scribbled onto the back of a directive folder the night before had unfolded in his mind with an eerie clarity, but the weight of it pressed down on him now, cold and heavy as iron chains. His eyes, rimmed with exhaustion, darted to the stacks of documents that lined his desk like soldiers awaiting orders. The Galactic Council's directives sat among them, their pristine pages gleaming under the faint morning light. Mark reached for one and ran his fingers over the embossed insignia, its sharp, circular lines mocking him. He exhaled slowly, crumpling the edge of the paper between his thumb and forefinger. A soft knock startled him. Clara stood in the doorway, her arms wrapped around a folder so thick it seemed ready to burst. The faint scent of jasmine followed her in, carried by the rustle of her coat. She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the disarray of his office. "Do you ever go home?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with worry. Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Not much point. Home feels smaller every day." Clara set the folder down on his desk, her fingers brushing against a precariously balanced coffee cup. "The Council's new quota system is starting next week. They're requisitioning energy reserves and diverting them off-world." Her voice trembled slightly. "This one's bad, Mark." He flipped through the folder. The words blurred in his vision, all clipped phrases and sterile language, but the intent was clear: to strip Earth of what little it had left. A low growl rose in his throat, and he slammed the folder shut. "They're turning us into a carcass," he muttered, "and they're picking us clean before the body's cold." Clara lowered herself into the chair opposite him, folding her hands tightly on her lap. "You've got something planned. I can tell. What is it?" Mark studied her for a long moment, his face unreadable. The edges of a shadow played across his jawline, cast by the weak light filtering through the window blinds. Finally he spoke. "I need your trust, Clara, and your discretion." Her brow furrowed, but she nodded. "You've got both." "Good." Mark straightened, his exhaustion forgotten. "Here's what we're going to do." The hours that followed unfolded like a quiet storm. Mark's office became a hive of whispered conversations and hastily scribbled notes. Clara worked beside him, her sharp eyes scanning every line of the Council's decrees. They combed through layers of dense, alien bureaucracy, searching for vulnerabilities hidden beneath its polished surface. By evening, a small group of trusted colleagues had joined them. They gathered in the dimly lit space, their faces tense with a mixture of determination and unease. Mark stood at the head of the room, his voice steady despite the fear flickering in his chest. They think they've got us boxed in, he said, his words deliberate, weighted. But their strength is also their weakness. Their rules are their armor, and their prison. Eli Vance leaned against the wall, arms crossed. You're talking about finding cracks in the system. Mark's lips twitched into a faint smile. Not cracks, holes. Vast, gaping ones they've blinded themselves to. A skeptical voice cut through the room. Even if we find them, what then? We're not soldiers. No, Mark agreed, his gaze steady. We're something far more dangerous. We're people who've spent our lives surviving in broken systems. They don't know what it's like to navigate chaos. We do, Clara added. If we flood their system with enough filings, objections, and procedural demands, we can grind them to a halt. It's a start, Mark said, but we need more than paperwork. We need strategy. The room fell silent, the air thick with the scent of worn leather and stale coffee. Mark could hear the faint hum of a council drone outside, its low vibrations like a distant predator circling its prey. Operation Bureaucratic Butterfly, he said finally. The name hung in the air, absurd and ominous. Mark explained in clipped, precise sentences how they would weaponize the Council's own systems against them. Every directive they issued would be twisted, misinterpreted, or buried under an avalanche of compliance filings. They would be unrelenting, surgical. His voice trailed off as his gaze fell on a convoy winding through the city below. Gleaming council transporters, their surfaces polished to a mirror-like sheen, rumbled through the narrow streets. Behind them, smaller utility vehicles followed, each loaded with crates marked with alien glyphs. Mark's lips curled into a grim smile. They don't see it, he murmured. They never do. A machine like theirs doesn't notice the gears slipping until the whole thing grinds to a halt. Behind him, the door to the rooftop creaked open. Eli Vance stepped out, his boots scuffing against the cracked concrete. He carried a tablet tucked under his arm, its screen glowing faintly with rows of data. You're talking to yourself again, Eli said, his voice carrying a mix of teasing and concern. Mark didn't look at him. Sometimes you have to hear the words out loud to make sense of them. Eli joined him at the edge, following Mark's gaze to the convoy below. The vehicles moved in perfect precision, their formation sterile and efficient. That's tonight's target? Eli asked, shifting his weight. Mark nodded. They're transporting energy reserves out of the city. The Council's draining us dry, piece by piece. Eli exhaled sharply, his breath visible in the chill air. And you think tonight's the night we make them notice? Mark's jaw tightened. He glanced at Eli, his voice low and resolute. Not just notice. Tonight we make them bleed. The ambush was set with surgical precision, the kind of coordination that could only come from months of quiet, tireless preparation. Mark's team had grown from a handful of bureaucrats and strategists to a sprawling network of underground cells, each one trained to exploit the Council's own methods against them. The convoy entered an industrial district, its towering structures casting long, jagged shadows over the streets. Steam hissed from vents, filling the air with a metallic tang. Mark crouched behind a stack of rusted crates, his breath steady as he listened to the rhythmic hum of the transporter's engines. Clara's voice crackled in his earpiece. Positions confirmed. Everyone's in place. Mark's heart thrummed with a mixture of anticipation and dread. His hand brushed the edge of the tablet resting beside him, its screen displaying a live feed from the convoy's path. Hold, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The minutes stretched thin, each second an eternity. The transporters moved steadily forward, their lights cutting through the haze. Mark could feel the tension coiling around him like a serpent, ready to strike. And then, a distant explosion shattered the night. The lead transporter jerked to a halt, its sleek surface marred by a spray of debris. Smoke billowed from a nearby building, the acrid smell filling the air. Mark could hear the shouts of the Council enforcers, their voices sharp and clipped. Go, he said into the earpiece, his voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through his veins. The strike teams moved with practiced precision. Mark watched as Clara led her group toward the rear of the convoy, their movements swift and deliberate. Eli's team emerged from a side street, their weapons glinting in the dim light. The first clash was deafening. Alien enforcers in their insectile armor fired beams of searing light, the air crackling with each shot. Mark's team responded with calculated ferocity, their weapons crude but effective, designed to exploit the Council's weaknesses. Mark stayed back, his eyes fixed on the tablet as he coordinated the assault. The feed showed Clara's team disabling one of the utility vehicles, its cargo spilling across the street. Mark recognized the alien glyphs on the crates, energy reserves meant to power the Council's operations off-world. The battle raged around him, the sounds of shouts and explosions reverberating through the streets. Mark's thoughts swirled with the weight of what they were doing. This wasn't just defiance, it was war. He clenched his jaw, his voice sharp in the earpiece. "Clara, status?" "2 down," she replied, her voice strained. "We're securing the reserves, but resistance is heavier than expected." Mark's hand tightened around the edge of the tablet. He could see her team pinned down behind a barricade, the enforcers advancing with relentless precision. "Eli," Mark said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Cut off their reinforcements, now." Eli's reply crackled through the earpiece. "On it." Mark's heart pounded as he watched the plan unfold. The enforcers were strong, but they were rigid, bound by protocols that couldn't adapt to the chaos his team had unleashed. The air smelled of scorched metal and smoke, the acrid taste sharp on Mark's tongue. He ducked as a stray beam of light sliced through the crates beside him, the heat brushing against his face. "They think they're untouchable," Mark muttered to himself, his voice low and fierce. "But even the strongest machine falls apart when you know where to strike." The battle reached its crescendo as Eli's team detonated a second charge, cutting off the enforcers' retreat. The convoy was in disarray, its formation shattered. Mark stepped into the fray, his movements deliberate. The air was thick with smoke and the coppery scent of blood, but he didn't falter. He reached the disabled utility vehicle and helped Clara secure the last of the crates. Her face streaked with sweat and soot. "We did it," she said, her voice hoarse but triumphant. Mark nodded, his gaze sweeping the chaos around them. The enforcers were retreating, their movements erratic as they tried to regroup. But Mark's thoughts were already ahead, his mind turning over the implications of what they'd just done. This wasn't just a victory. It was a message. He looked at Clara, his voice quiet but firm. "This is only the beginning." As the first hints of dawn crept over the city, painting the sky in shades of ash and gold, Mark felt the weight of what lay ahead. The Council would retaliate. He could feel it, looming like a storm on the horizon. But for now, they had made their mark, and the machine had started to crumble. The air above the city shimmered with an unnatural charge, like the breathless silence before a lightning strike. In the dim light of dawn, the skyline was cloaked in shadows, its jagged edges framed by the occasional pulse of a Galactic Council drone's searchlight. The drones patrolled tirelessly now, their deep hum resonating like a low growl across the rooftops. The Council had responded with terrifying precision to the ambush on their convoy, and Earth was beginning to buckle under the weight of their fury. Mark Anders stood in the cavernous underground bunker that served as the Resistance's central command, his reflection caught in the fractured glass of an old map case. His eyes were shadowed, his jaw set. Around him the air buzzed with urgency, the whir of cooling fans from makeshift servers, the crackle of radio static, and the low murmur of strategists huddled over holographic displays. The Council had sent reinforcements within hours of the convoy ambush. Their retaliation was swift and merciless. Orbital blockades severed Earth's supply lines, while massive energy domes flickered into place over key Council outposts, rendering them impenetrable to conventional weapons. The once bustling streets now echoed with the sound of boots on pavement and the constant thrum of surveillance machines. Mark turned to Eli Vance, who stood beside him, scrolling through lines of code on a battered tablet. The faint green glow illuminated Eli's furrowed brow. "How long until the EMP units are operational?" Mark asked, his voice a rasp of exhaustion and determination. Eli didn't look up. "Another 12 hours, if the engineers don't pass out from exhaustion. These things weren't exactly built to take out interstellar tech, Mark." "They don't have to," Mark replied. "We just need to disrupt their communication grid long enough to force their hand." Clara appeared beside them, her hair tied back and her face streaked with grease. She tossed a folded map onto the table. We've identified their primary data relay hub. It's in Sector 7, buried under one of their energy domes. If we can disable it, we'll cut off their ability to coordinate with the fleet. Mark studied the map, his fingers tracing the faded lines. It's heavily fortified. What's the plan? Clara's lips thinned. We hit them with an EMP strike to take down the dome temporarily. Then a ground team infiltrates and uploads the worm Eli's been working on. It'll wreak havoc on their systems, scramble their targeting protocols, disrupt troop movements, maybe even shut down their drones. Eli interjected. It's a long shot. Their tech is light years ahead of ours. If the worm fails... Mark cut him off, his voice steely. It won't fail. It can't. The team fell silent, the weight of the moment settling over them like a shroud. Mark turned to Clara. Who's leading the infiltration? She hesitated. I will. My team's already familiar with the layout, and we've trained for this. No, Mark said firmly. You're too valuable here. I'll lead the strike team. Clara's eyes flashed. You're the face of this resistance, Mark. If you go down, we lose more than just a leader. We lose hope. Mark held her gaze for a moment before nodding reluctantly. Fine, but you'd better make it back. The night of the operation came quickly. The team moved through the city's skeletal remains under cover of darkness, the smell of scorched metal and burnt plastic thick in the air. Mark watched from the command center as the strike team crept toward the energy dome, their movements ghost-like against the ruins. Clara's voice crackled over the comms. We're in position. EMP in 3, 2... A blinding flash lit up the sky, and the air seemed to collapse inward with a deafening crack. The dome shimmered, flickered, and then dissolved, its protective barrier falling like shattered glass. Go! Mark barked into the comms. Clara's team surged forward, their figures barely visible through the haze. The Resistance's modified weapons, hybrid designs incorporating salvaged alien tech, lit up the battlefield. Pulses of energy sliced through the air, illuminating the chaos in stark, strobe-like flashes. From the command center, Mark could hear the distant roar of gunfire, the shriek of Council enforcers, and the shouts of his people. His hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles turned white. Clara, report, he demanded. Her voice came back, strained but steady. We've breached the perimeter. Uploading the worm now. The minutes dragged on like hours. Mark's heart pounded as he watched the live feed on the monitors, his stomach twisting with every flicker of static. The resistance fighters were outnumbered and outgunned, their movements desperate yet calculated. Suddenly, the feed went dark. Clara? Mark's voice was sharp with alarm. Clara, do you copy? Static. He slammed his fist onto the table, the sound reverberating through the room. Around him the tension was palpable, the faint smell of sweat and fear mingling with the hum of the equipment. Then her voice came through, faint and broken. The worm's in, but we've pinned down. Mark's jaw clenched. Hold your position. We're sending reinforcements. No. Clara's voice was firm, despite the pain he could hear beneath it. If we stay, we'll buy you time to extract the rest. Don't you dare, Mark started, but her next words cut him off. This is bigger than me, Mark. You know that. The comms went silent again, and Mark felt the world tilt beneath him. He turned to Eli, his voice a low growl. Send reinforcements. Now. Eli hesitated, his face pale. Mark, if we divert resources now, we risk exposing the other teams. Mark's hand slammed onto the table again, the sound like a gunshot. I'm not leaving her to die. But even as he spoke, he knew the truth. Clara's sacrifice was already written in the lines of smoke curling over the city. The worm worked. Across the city, Council systems began to collapse, their drones falling from the sky like wounded birds. The resistance struck in coordinated waves, exploiting every vulnerability the worm had created. But Mark couldn't feel the victory. Clara's absence was a void, a sharp, hollow ache that cut deeper than he expected. He stood in the wreckage of the command center, the taste of ash and regret heavy on his tongue. Around him, the surviving fighters celebrated quietly, their voices muted by the weight of what had been lost. Mark turned to Eli, his voice barely above a whisper. "We're not done. Not until we've taken their heart." Eli nodded, but his face was somber. "We've won this battle, Mark, but the war's far from over." Mark's gaze hardened. "Then we'll fight until it is. For Clara. For all of them." The night stretched on, heavy with both triumph and grief, as the resistance prepared for the next move in a war that would define humanity's future. The night was a cacophony of destruction, fire, and chaos. The horizon glowed with the eerie orange of burning metal and collapsing structures. Galactic Council ships loomed like monstrous silhouettes in the sky, their sleek, ominous forms reflecting the flickering flames below. The ground trembled beneath Mark Anders's feet as he stood on a ruined balcony overlooking what remained of the city. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a crucible. In the distance, the Council's central command tower rose defiantly, its sleek black surface unmarred despite the onslaught. Mark's jaw tightened as he adjusted the comms unit strapped to his ear. Around him, the resistance forces gathered, engineers clutching salvaged weapons, soldiers smeared with soot and blood, and civilians with eyes hardened by the loss of everything they'd once known. Mark turned to Eli Vance, who was kneeling beside a holographic display, flickering with the outlines of their final plan. Eli's face was drawn, his lips pressed into a tight line. "The EMP worked. Their drones are blind, their targeting systems are still scrambled, but the tower itself, it's shielded with a localized energy core. We can't take it down from here." Mark's voice was steel. "Then we go in. We hit them at the source." Eli hesitated, his eyes darting to the grim faces around them. "You know what that means. If we breach the tower, they'll throw everything they've got at us. We might not make it out." Mark met his gaze, his voice low, but carrying the weight of every sacrifice that had led them here. "It's not about making it out. It's about finishing what we started. They came to break us. We'll show them what humanity does when it's cornered." The resistance moved with ghost-like precision through the ravaged streets, the scent of scorched earth and ionized air thick in their lungs. Every shadow felt like a threat, every distant sound a reminder of how fragile their lives were. The tower loomed closer, its surface glistening under the harsh light of alien spotlights. Mark raised his hand, signaling the team to halt. He could feel the tension coiling around them, an invisible wire pulled taut. Clara's absence weighed heavily on his mind. Her sacrifice had opened the path to this moment, but her voice still echoed in his thoughts. "This is bigger than me, Mark. You know that." He tightened his grip on his rifle. "Let's make her proud," he whispered, his words swallowed by the wind. Eli's voice crackled in his ear. "Mark, the cyber team's in place. We're ready to disable the outer shields, but it's only going to give you a 2-minute window to breach the entrance." "Understood," Mark replied. He turned to his team, his voice steady despite the chaos roaring around them. 2 minutes, that's all we need. Let's show them what Earth is made of." The assault began with a deafening explosion, a column of fire tearing through the base of the tower's perimeter. Mark's team surged forward, their boots pounding against the cracked pavement. The Council's enforcers emerged from the shadows, their insectile armor gleaming as they unleashed a barrage of energy blasts. The air sizzled with heat and electricity, the smell of burning ozone stinging Mark's nose. He ducked behind a shattered wall, his breath coming in sharp gasps as he exchanged fire with the advancing enforcers. Around him, his team fought with unyielding ferocity, their weapons cobbled together from alien tech and human ingenuity. A scream pierced the air as one of his soldiers fell, their body crumpling under a volley of fire. Mark's heart clenched, but he forced himself to keep moving. Every step forward felt like a battle against gravity, against despair. "Shields down!" Eli's voice rang in his ear. "You've got 60 seconds!" Mark didn't hesitate. He charged through the opening, his team following close behind. The tower's entrance loomed ahead, a massive steel door engraved with alien glyphs. "Breaching now!" Clara's second-in-command shouted, slapping an explosive charge onto the door. The blast tore through the metal, and the team surged into the tower's heart. The interior was cold and sterile, the walls pulsing faintly with alien light. The hum of the energy core was a constant vibration in the air, rattling through Mark's bones. The team moved quickly, sweeping through the corridors with ruthless efficiency. "We're close," Eli said, his voice urgent. "The core room is up ahead, but security's going to be heavy." They rounded a corner and met a wall of enforcers. The corridor erupted into chaos, the air filled with the sound of gunfire and the sharp, acrid smell of blood. Mark's shoulders slammed into a bulkhead as he fired, his vision narrowing to the simple, primal act of survival. "Push forward!" he roared, his voice hoarse. The resistance forces pressed on, their determination outweighing their fear. One by one, the enforcers fell, their armor shattering under the relentless assault. Mark's arms burned from the weight of his rifle, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Finally, they reached the core room. The air here was suffused with a sickly green glow, the energy pulsing like a living thing. Eli worked quickly, connecting his tablet to the alien interface. His fingers flew across the screen, sweat dripping down his face. "Mark, I'm in," Eli said, his voice tight. "This is it. Once I overload the core, the entire tower will collapse, but we've got less than 3 minutes to get out." Mark nodded, his gaze sweeping the room. The resistance forces were battered, their faces pale with exhaustion, but they stood ready. "This is it," Mark said, his voice steady. "Everything we've fought for, everything we've lost, it ends here. They came here to tear us apart, but we're going to show them what it means to fight back. Humanity doesn't bow. We don't break. We endure." The team erupted into action as the core began to overload, the energy growing brighter and more unstable. The floor trembled beneath them, cracks spidering through the walls. "Move!" Mark shouted, leading the charge back through the corridors. The tower groaned like a dying beast, its structure unraveling as the core's energy surged out of control. The team burst out into the open air, just as the tower collapsed behind them, a massive explosion tearing through the sky. The shockwave knocked Mark off his feet, the ground trembling like an earthquake. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the comms crackled to life. "We did it," Eli's voice said, barely above a whisper. "The Council's command network is gone." Mark pushed himself to his feet, his chest heaving as he looked out at the burning wreckage. Around him, the surviving fighters began to cheer, their voices rising like a battle cry. "They thought we were insects," Mark murmured, his voice low. "But they forgot one thing about humanity." He turned to face his team, his gaze fierce. "When you push us too far, we don't just fight back, we rise." As the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, Mark stood amidst the ruins, a symbol of Earth's defiance. The Galactic Council had underestimated humanity, and now they would learn a truth carved into the ashes of their failure. Humanity didn't survive chaos. It thrived in it.